But he's quite happy for the children of state house families to do that.
Order. There's a point of order. The Honourable Dr.
Point of order,
Smith.
Mr. Speaker. It has been a long-held and strongly defended rule that the children of members of Parliament are not brought into the debate on contentious issues in this House.
Order. That is exactly right, and we'll have no more of this. I'll ask the member to continue. Families are not to be brought into this debate. Phil Crichton.
It is an outrageous double standard that this minister will happily impose insecurity of tenure on thousands and thousands of the most vulnerable families in our country, while he applies a totally different standard to himself. He should be ashamed of himself. Reviewable tenancies are the reason that Labor is opposing this bill, because it will do incalculable damage to families in this country who, quite frankly, deserve better. We had expert submissions at Select Committee who came along and said that this minister's policy to give himself the power to throw out senior citizens out of their house simply because there aren't enough state houses. They came along, the country's most distinguished public health researchers and academics came to the Select Committee and said this will pose a public health risk. The minister's own intellectual mentors, the Productivity Commission, the Housing Shareholders Advisory Group, they both came along and explicitly advised not to implement reviewable tenancies, that it is bad policy and that it would be bad for people. And I don't know what side of the minister's mouth he's talking about when he says it's not true, but it is there in black and white in their discussions. They oppose reviewable tenancies. And the minister stands up in this House and he says, no, it's not true. These people are the intellectual architects of this policy. Well, that is a load of hogwash, and it is breathtaking arrogance by that minister. He says everybody else has got it wrong, and he's right. And he's given himself the power in this bill, in this bit of legislation, to throw out 80-year-olds out of their house because there aren't enough houses, and that is an utter disgrace. We will not support that, sir, and if you look at this bill in the context of the National Party's stewardship of state housing policy, let's look at their record, let's look at what they've done. They came in and they tightened the eligibility criteria for state houses. At the stroke of a pen, they got rid of half the waiting list. They got rid of half the waiting list, and the upshot of that was that all over provincial New Zealand there are hundreds of empty state houses, perfectly good state houses lying empty, because this National Party government has tightened the eligibility criteria so tight that people who are living in poverty still cannot get a state house in many parts of provincial New Zealand. What else have they done? They squeezed for the first 3 years, as the Salvation Army report showed a few days ago, they squeezed the financial lifeblood out of Housing New Zealand to pay for their tax cuts for the rich. That's what they did. They sliced back the annual capital contribution by the Crown. The figures do not lie, Dr. Smith. You slashed the Crown's capital contribution, and you hiked the dividends.
Order.
So that over the first, not you, Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about the minister and his government, they, in the first 3 years under their stewardship, they actually withdrew a net financial amount of $142 million, in contrast to the Labor government, who for the 8 or 9 years prior actually made a net positive contribution of nearly $500 million. Now, what sort of government milks the state social housing agency in the height of a housing crisis? I'll tell you, it's the same kind of government that stands up and delivers their budget and announces a target of evicting 3,000 State House tenants. That is the National Party for you. That speaks volumes about their attitude to State House tenants. What else have they done? In this bill, they are shifting eligibility, the eligibility assessment task to the Ministry of Social Development. They are extending the income-related rent subsidy, sir, to NGOs, and if we've said time and time again in this debate, Labor is not opposed to that. We're not opposed, in fact, to the minister's intention to shift housing stock across to the community housing providers. That makes sense, but we will not support it in the context of a diminishing pie. This minister has overseen a reduction in the number of state houses, over 700 fewer state houses in the last 2 years. Whenever he's asked about it, he blathers on about the Christchurch earthquake. Well, the reduction in state houses has happened after the Christchurch earthquake. He cannot blame the Christchurch earthquake for the reduction in state housing stock. And he sits there shaking his head, but he knows, sir, that it's true. The big lesson from the devolution of social services over the last 2 or 3 decades has been that if the funding doesn't follow the devolution of services and assets, then those services become unsustainable. And the providers of those services get run ragged and constantly have to come back to the government with a begging bowl. And it's the consumers, the recipients of those services, who suffer. And we predict, sir, that is what will happen under this National Party plan, to run down, to wind back Housing New Zealand, to flick off 20% of the stock without a significant financial commitment to maintaining that stock. That is the track record of the National Party, sir, and we predict that it would happen again in this case. The Minister's vision is for a contestable market for social housing. What kind of planet is he on? We're talking about putting a roof over the heads of the most vulnerable people in New Zealand, and he wants to set up a contestable market where Housing New Zealand competes with the Salvation Army for tenants and subsidies. What absolute lunacy. Why would we think any different from this party, from the National Party? They've run down Housing New Zealand. They have used it as a... The Minister denies it, but the figures do not lie. The Minister has made a net financial withdrawal from Housing New Zealand of $142 million in the first 3 years. The figure, it's all there in black and white. They have used it as a cash cow to pay for their tax cuts. They have run down and reduced the number of state houses in the middle of a housing crisis. They have rewritten the eligibility criteria to just to cut the waiting list in half, and they've disenfranchised very poor people in provincial cities who have been hived off into the private rental market, where they are living in substandard and overcrowded conditions while state houses lie empty in the same streets. They have committed $27 million over 4 years for the community housing sector, sir, and as the Salvation Army has pointed out, that is lacking in any kind of credibility in terms of backing that minister's claim to be committed to resourcing and empowering the community housing sector. With this bill, sir, National is washing their hands of responsibility for State House tenants. This is just the latest chapter in National's hostility to social housing and state housing. We've seen it all the way through the decades, and we saw it in the 90s when they sold off 13,000 state houses, where they bumped up rents to market-related rents. This is just, as speakers earlier in the evening have pointed out, this is just the latest move by the National Party to wash its hands of responsibility for putting a roof over the heads of some of the poorest and most disadvantaged New Zealanders. We think that's a disgrace. From that minister particularly, it shows a breathtaking double standard, and Sir, Labour is utterly opposed to this bill.
Paseta Samlu Doinga.
Mr. Speaker, during the 2011 election campaign,